Almost 2 months since the October 7 terror attack on Israel, and 6 days into a tenuous ceasefire, the situation in Palestine and in Israel remains fraught. How should we understand the situation? What are the prospects for, say, an extension of the pause in fighting, for the release of all remaining hostages and prisoners, even eventually for a more permanent peace? In Israel, in particular, what is the national mood almost 2 months since the attack? Where does public opinion lie in relation to the war in Gaza? Good evening. I'm John Nery, and you are watching a special edition of In the Public Square. To try to understand Israel's position, and more important, to get a sense of what the Israeli public is thinking, I've invited an outstanding journalist who is also a personal friend. Dina Kraft is the opinion editor of the Haaretz newspaper, English edition. She has reported on the region for over 2 decades, writing for newspapers like the New York Times and wire services like the Associated Press. This year, she added a new distinction. She co-authored the best-selling book, My Friend, Anne Frank. She joins us from Tel Aviv. Good evening, Dina. Thank you for joining us in the Public Square.
Good evening, John. So good to be with you today.
How would you describe the mood in Israel today after the first hostages had been released?
Yeah, I would say the mood is, on the one hand, it's very mixed. It's been a complete roller coaster here. You have the sort of the split screen images of these hostages coming across the border. You know, everyone's gathered around their TV screen, seeing who they can see. They're not releasing the names beforehand. So as we see them coming across, they're being identified. And then soon after, you're seeing these very joyous reunions between, mothers and their children, between fathers and sometimes their mothers and children, and all sorts of combinations. Of course, it's women and children that have been released to date, with the exception of one man who has Russian citizenship. But the mood, I would say, is high anxiety. People are having trouble sleeping, as they've been having since the beginning of this terrible ordeal. But there's this complete anguish over and frustration in the way that Hamas is sort of playing with Israel, like as if it's sort of a puppeteer, and Israel is its toy puppet. Dangling different names of hostages, dangling the prospect of more hostages now with the extension of the ceasefire by 2 days. Will they actually come? Will they not? Will they release all the mothers and all the children? There are some children who become sort of symbols of this. There's a little 3-year-old girl who was released 2 nights ago, who saw her mother murdered by Hamas terrorists the day of the attack on her kibbutz. She rushed into her arms of her father, and then he was shot and killed while she protecting her. She was among those released, and she's become a symbol. Another symbol are 2 little boys. One is not a boy, he's a baby, he's an infant. He's only 10 months old when he was captured. He had his 11-month birthday in captivity. He and his brother, who were 4 years old, are captured with both of their parents. We don't know where they are. Hamas is saying some other group has them, perhaps the PFLP. So there's a lot of agony and a lot of just frustration with this feeling that Hamas is sort of twisting the knife and being especially cruel in the way they're sort of doling out this hostage release.
What is it like to be in what is now called Hostage Square? I mean, can you sort of describe the scene there?
It's incredibly emotional. It's kind of like a little bit, the first time I arrived, I felt like I was in a Twilight Zone that was sort of part art exhibit, right? You have all of these posters everywhere with the faces of these people and their names and their ages. And of course, they span from, 10-month, 11-month-old little baby Kfir to women in their 80s. A lot of these older women have now been released in this last go around of hostage releases. You have 13-year-olds. I mean, I have my own, like a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I can't help but see the faces of my own children in these faces of these posters, and everybody can see. It feels very, very deeply personal. This is not a removed trauma. Israel is going through a collective trauma right now, as are the Palestinians in Gaza, right? But the mood on the square, it's very eerie. I mean, you see on the one hand, the posters being hung, You see family members saying, my
Mhm.
son is in Gaza. It's very intense. You see like art installations. Like, for example, a long table has been set, like for a Shabbat Sabbath dinner, with all the places, originally it was about 240 places of the hostages that are in captivity. There's also yellow chairs set up to symbolize each and every one of those taken. There's also a huge screen with a countdown of the amount of the numbers of days and hours and even minutes and even seconds that they've been gone. And then people congregate there throughout the day. There are different events, and then especially in the evenings, in recent evenings when they've been having these hostage releases, people gather there. And on the one hand, there's a sense of like jubilation and elation when you see,
Mhm.
the first releases, and there was even people dancing in the square, I think, the first night. There's also this message that is 100% uniform from anybody who speaks out, that Israel is, thrilled for every hostage, every life that has come back, but they all must come back. Every single person must come back. Among those that came back in the first release was actually a Filipino woman who was a
Mhm.
caretaker of one of the people in the kibbutz. The kibbutz team have lots of older people in them, and often they have caretakers who come from the Philippines. So the Philippines, as you know, has been directly impacted by this as well.
That's right. Why that particular square? Who chose it? Was it like the public just gathered there and started waiting there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's right in front of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, and it's a place that has been a place of public gathering recently.
Mhm.
In Tel Aviv, historically, since Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, was assassinated many
Mhm.
years ago, now in 2005. Sorry, in 1995. Sorry.
Mhm.
There's a square that's been named after him, and that's the main square in Tel Aviv. But there's a light rail project going on, and so that square is no longer possible to be used. So the
Mhm.
public settings have sort of changed in Tel Aviv. So one of the public gathering spots in the last year has been this square for other
Mhm.
protests. So I think that's why it was chosen. And it's very central, and people can get to it easily. And people are coming from all over the country. Buses are coming in on Saturday nights to attend these rallies. As you may know, for the last previous 10 months before the war began, Israelis were in the streets every single night. I mean, sorry, not
That's right.
every single Saturday night in
Yeah,
very large numbers, sometimes
Mhm.
200,000, and sometimes
That's right.
over that, consistently. Was the longest consistent peaceful civic protest, I think, in modern history.
Mhm.
And it was a call for Netanyahu to stop his power grab. So you have that in the context. You have a very well organized grassroots right now
Mhm.
movement that was behind that, and that some of that same grassroots movements have been mobilized around the hostage families and around mobilization and civic action in general.
So the pause in the fighting has been extended by 2 days. Is there strong public support for another extension of the ceasefire, or is there only a limited and narrowing window for the
Yeah,
exchange of
that's a good
hostages?
question. I haven't seen any numbers yet about statistics. I mean, 'cause it's just been the ceasefire. Just the news just came out yesterday that's going to be extended. There was definitely support, I think, for the first ceasefire. Definitely support for bringing the hostages back. I mean, I think people feel like this war will not be a war that can be won without the hostages fully returning, all of them.
Mhm. Mhm.
On the other hand, there's a really acute understanding that if Hamas is left with its current capacities, that it has not been completely, unarmed and demobilized, and its leadership has not completely been stripped of
Mhm.
its power, that the war cannot end. Most Israelis, I think, believe that they will not be safe, that this country will not be, its borders will not be protected in the south if Hamas is not removed. And the fear is if the war stops, as difficult as it is, that Hamas will be able to sort of, come up for another day and will
Mhm.
again attack and will again create the kind of horrible images of carnage that we saw on October 7th.
What made the pause in the fighting, the ceasefire, possible on Israel's side?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, a lot of pressure, a lot of pressure. It's really interesting the role that the Qataris have been playing.
mhm.
Qatar, of course, is both an ally of the U.S., but
Mhm.
also has given safe haven to Hamas
Mhm.
since Hamas was kicked out of Syria. So they played a very important role diplomatically in being a bridge between the players. Of course, there's a lot of pressure from the United States for this pause. There's a lot of pushback, of course, in America and around the world about the terrible, civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip. We're up to, well over 10,000 dead in Gaza. We don't. The numbers come from the Hamas-controlled health ministry, so we can't confirm those numbers precisely. And we also they do not distinguish who among those numbers are actually Hamas fighters as well. But we know that a lot of them, a good portion, are women and children. So there's a lot of public, international pressure to pause, and if not, and more than that, to have a ceasefire.
Is there
Yeah.
Is there internal pressure as well?
There is some. There is some.
Movement. Is
Right.
there some?
There is some internal pressure, especially, I think from some members of the hostage families and the hostage family community, you could call it. Also from the left wing, especially from the further left wing parts of the country, who say this is immoral. This is slipping into, possible, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Of course, you hear the word genocide being floated around lots and lots, and that, of course, is very much condemned and dismissed by most of the Israeli public and by the Israeli leadership as completely hyperbole, and they point to the fact that they say, if this, genocide according to international law is about intent, and Israel is doing its best to protect civilians. So that is the claim, by encouraging Gazans in the north of Gaza, which is where the majority of the fighting has been, to flee south. But no one can sort of ignore the incredible, horrendous death toll, and also the moral stain it could potentially have on Israel, not just currently, but going forward. So there's a lot of very difficult choices for Israel going forward. None of them are particularly good. Also, you have to remember, we have a very unpopular prime minister right now, right? Most polls that we do know is the majority of Israelis want him out, and not just from the left and not just from the center, from the right. It was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and of political leadership that this war, that the Hamas was able to breach the fences and able to commit its atrocities. So you have that on the one hand, and you also have an internal debate in Israel whether Bibi, sorry, that's his nickname, Bibi Netanyahu, should step down now during the war, or if he should leave only after the war. There's a growing, I would say, voices for him to leave now, that it's sort of untenable, especially because some are saying, what incentive does he have to end this war? Because he knows at the end of the day, when the war ends, there'll be a very big call for his ouster. So although there's a lot of will to get him out, the question of the timing. And there's also, you asked about the mood in Israel. On the one hand, it's incredibly somber. This is a very sad place right now. People are mourning, they're grieving, they're in shock. And I would say in some ways, people are even more horrified this week than they were even last week, because on the one hand, there's this incredible joy and relief to see these children reunited with their families, women. But on the other hand, obviously there's the refugees, so they're the hostages left behind, but also we're hearing stories, we're hearing what their lives were like, in captivity. We're hearing the aunt of a 12-year-old boy said yesterday that he was meant to repeatedly watch, forced to repeatedly watch videos of the October 7th attack, which, many of you viewers may know are horrific. They're of actual crimes being committed. They're of, people being, I'm not going to go into details, but, horrible, horrible images that nobody should be forced to see. There's also terrible fear, of course, for the women who are being held in the Gaza Strip, particularly. We know that there are many reports of systematic rape of the women on October 7th. And there's a fear that that could be happening, of course, inside the Gaza Strip as well.
If I understand the chronology correctly, it took several months before Golda Meir resigned as prime minister after the 1973 war. It might take several months also for Netanyahu. I don't know about that, but you were talking of many difficult decisions that Israel has to make, and I think one of them has to do with the resumption of the military response. My question is that resumption inevitable? I seem to have heard you say that there is public support for it, resuming even if all the hostages are returned, if there is no degradation in the capacity of Hamas?
I mean, I think right now the sense is, there's a great hope that all the hostages will be returned. But there's a sense that as long as the fighting's going on, they will not be. We also have reason to believe they're not going to let the men go anytime soon as well. They're going to be holding on to them. They they're going to ask for very heavy hitting prisoners, in a return. That will be a very painful exchange for Israel to make. We also don't know if these hostages are dead or alive. Remember that Red Cross has not been able. The Hamas has reneged. Well, Israel said that Hamas had agreed in the truce agreement to let the Red Cross visit the hostages. And then they said that Hamas reneged on that. Hamas says they never agreed to that in the first place. So it's not entirely clear. But at any rate, we don't know if these hostages are all, who are being in captivity, what their status is. But on Friday, when the ceasefire ends, I think there's a very good chance the fighting will resume. That is what the military wants. That's what the government wants. And that's what a good chunk of the Israeli public wants. Again, not because they want to see, more catastrophic losses on the side of the Palestinians, but because they feel that Israel is unsafe right now in a current situation with Hamas at its border. Hamas, you should remember, has a genocidal agenda that they have not hidden. They have in their charter that they want to wipe out every Jew between the river and the sea. Okay, this is not a organization that is seeking peace, that is seeking reconciliation. This is not Fatah in the West Bank. This is not the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It's an entirely different entity. And they have made it, in recent years, they have sort of been saying one thing with their political leaders and something else with their military leaders. But if you listen to what the military leaders have been saying all along, they've been saying, we will wait till the time is right. We'll make Israel suffer and suffer slowly. And those are the words of Yahya Sinwar, who is the military chief of Hamas, who, by the way, according to the hostages, came out and who speaks fluent Hebrew because he spent over 20 years in Israeli prison. And he was himself a student of Israel and Israeli society, which is why I think he's been able to so effectively, understand what Israel's soft underbelly is, which is the fear of hostage taking, for example, and the vulnerability that Israelis feel. And he's played with that very much in his actions now. But he came to them speaking perfect Hebrew and said, you're going to be released. But there are many more hostages still, of course, we presume, underground in the tunnels that Hamas has made. It's very difficult warfare. The other part of the challenge, we talk about Israel going back in, the most of Hamas leadership is underground, deep underground.
I wanted to ask about that. Is there some sort of public consensus on the conditions of military victory? I understand there's something like 40,000 Hamas regulars. Is there like a number that the public sort of has set its heart on, or are you looking at taking out the heads, the leaders of Hamas? How is military success being defined?
That's a really good question. I think it has not been defined. I think it's been about these very grand general statements about rooting them out and making sure that they, that Hamas is flattened and that Hamas is, can never ever rear its head again. But what does that mean numbers wise? What does that mean tactically, operationally? That has been left to one's imagination. There haven't, as far as I know, haven't been numbers floated. I know they've been very open about, the amount of Hamas leadership that they've managed to kill, which is not a small number, and it's a growing number of key leadership figures. But an actual sort of number and an actual picture of what victory would look like, I don't know. And you definitely have people saying that even if there is a quote unquote military victory over Hamas, if the hostages don't come back, this will not be a victory. This will not feel like a victory for Israelis. The only way for Israel to sort of go forward and heal as a nation, as a society, is if the hostages are returned or the fate of the hostages is fully known.
Not to reduce this to just near numbers, but right now we're looking at around 80 hostages have been released, something like that. So we're looking at maybe around 90 or 100 still in captivity.
Yeah,
that's the situation now, right?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure it's quite 80 yet. I mean, there was 50, I think, to date, and then today there's going to be 20 more. That's the idea, at least. So I don't know if we're quite up to 80 yet. But and there were before that there were 236. So yeah, So it'd be like 236 minus 70. I'm not very
Okay.
good at math. But yeah, it's a lot of people. I mean, you know, I covered when we first met, we had discussed the Gilad Shalit kidnapping. Gilad Shalit was a soldier who was kidnapped into Gaza in 2007, and for whom 1,000 prisoners were released 5 years later, including Sinwar, who now heads the military wing of Hamas. And I remember, like, you know, there was a huge movement in the streets. There was a whole country was galvanized and mobilized around one person who was also, you know, one 19-year-old soldier who had been captive. And now we have these are unimaginable numbers, you know, and you know, and these are whole families. These are whole like multi-generations of people that have been captured and taken into Gaza. So the whole country sort of feels like it's been taken hostage at the moment.
How has the October 7 attack or the war in Gaza reshaped the media landscape in Israel?
Sorry, what was how was it received? How it was
reshaped. Has there been a realignment in the media? Are you having problems reporting the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think
what are your opinion pages like these days?
I mean, there's a lot of anger and pushback against the government almost from day one, you know, including the pages of Haaretz, my newspaper, you know, calling on Netanyahu to, you know, take ownership and step down and all of this. But you have, I mean, in terms of the coverage, I say, you know, what Israelis are seeing on their screens is very different from what Palestinians are seeing on their screens. And this is not unique to this war. We've seen this in past wars too. Where, you know, in Israel, the focus is on the home front, the focus is on the soldiers going in, the focus on the families, on the bereaved, on the internal story happening here. I mean, we have also like tens of thousands of displaced people. Israel's never had like internal refugees before. It's Jewish Israelis, right? You've never had that before. And so now you have all of the people from the south, you know, from the border areas that have been moved into the other parts of the country. You have the whole kibbutzim, you know, where, for example, Kibbutz Be'eri, which was one of the ground zeros of the attack by Hamas, where 10% of the population was murdered and over 20 people were taken hostage. Most of the community now lives in a hotel in the Dead Sea. You have hotels all over the country where people, you know, also from the north, because there's been fears that Hezbollah would enter the game from Lebanon, excuse me, and that the fighting could get bad there. Right now, Hezbollah is kind of tickling along the edges. It's not been any kind of full-blown attack, and the second front is not open, but it remains very tense there. And there are many Israeli soldiers and reservists posted there. So you have people from the north, people from the south living now inside the country, and that's also a huge upheaval. So the media is very much focused on the Israeli story of suffering right now, and the Israeli story of grief and of loss, and trying to get it head wrapped, and also the Israeli story of what's happening with this government. And this government is a very right-wing government. And have said things that are very, very inflammatory, which have made people, you know, bristle around the world. You know, some of their statements, and there's also a sense of fear that some of these very, very far right-wing agitators who are in the government, who are actually ministers, are going to make things worse. The main program of the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is an extreme far right figure. Very polarizing. His answer to this war has been to loosen up the restrictions for Israeli civilians to get guns to protect themselves, and so there's a fear there. There's also, of course, the story of Palestinian citizens in Israel. Sometimes they're called Arab citizens or Arab Israelis, but they're Palestinians who stayed in Israel after 48, and they're describing very difficult times themselves. They fear, some of them have lost their jobs, some of them have been kicked out of universities for very anti-war, being very vocal about being against the war and what's happening in Gaza. So there's a lot of different factions, a lot of different things happening inside the country. The media is focused mostly on that. They're also focused, of course, what's happening inside Gaza, but you aren't seeing the personal stories, for example, of Palestinian families being wiped out, and of funerals of children and of babies. You're not seeing those images and people being rescued from the rubble. You're seeing them briefly, you know, here and there, but not in the way that a Palestinian would watching, for example, Al Jazeera or one of the local Palestinian stations. So part of the problem always, and sort of the perennial problem here of the victim Olympics, you know, and narrative, is that they're not seeing the same stories.
You've covered Israeli-Palestinian conflicts before. You've covered Palestinians, for instance. Are you or other journalists also in touch with Palestinian citizens? I mean,
Yeah,
human rights organizations and so on.
yeah, definitely,
What's
definitely.
happening behind the scenes? I mean, how are you helping each other out?
So interestingly, I have a colleague, a former AP colleague, who is a a journalist based in
Hmm.
Ramallah.
Hmm.
So, for example, he wrote a piece for me, an opinion piece about what it's like to be in the West Bank right now, what it's
Okay.
like to be when he feels, as he described it, that the Israeli soldiers have been given, it seems to him, sort of free hand to take revenge on the streets
Hmm.
there. Very quick to shoot, very quick to where before they may have shot tear gas, rubber bullets, there's now more live bullets being shot. He himself was recording for his media outlet in downtown Ramallah, and there were soldiers nearby. Not really entirely clear if they were chasing down stone throwers or what, but there were bullets that were shot towards his office, and some shattered some of the glass in his on the balcony of his office building. And also what's happening in the more sort of the outside of the cities in the West Bank, where you have Israeli settlers and you have Israeli soldiers who are committing more acts of
Hmm.
violence and being tougher on Palestinian citizens in the West Bank. So all of that is happening, and there's a real sense and a real fear that there could be another front that could open in this war, not just the southern front of Gaza, not
Hmm.
just God forbid the northern front at Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has much heavier weaponry than Hamas does and can cause much more damage to Israel, but
That's
also
right.
potentially a front in the West Bank. And it feels like the right-wing elements in the government and their sort of constituency as it
Hmm.
is in the West Bank are trying to inflame things in the West Bank almost. So there's a lot of fear. And so on the one hand, we have the sort of quiet, the beautiful, been a beautiful day in Tel Aviv today, the blue
Hmm.
skies, and people can do their shopping and not have to sort of wonder if they're going to have to dash into a bomb shelter.
Hmm.
And in Gaza, people can maybe sleep a little bit finally again,
Hmm.
and people are in Gaza going back to sort of regroup a little bit and bury their dead. On the other hand, we know that in a few days things could get very difficult once again.
And when you published that commentary by your Palestinian ex-colleague,
Yeah.
what was the response in Israel? um,
Yeah, I mean, I think the response in general to the weapon there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern and I think people, but before the war, were very concerned about the far right taking advantage of the situation
mhm,
of having power in the government. But now they're taking advantage of the sort of the fog of war to do more damage. There's been a lot of outrage against what's happening in the West Bank, on the one hand, especially by people who are following things closely. But I think on the other hand, the focus is still mostly on Gaza, and the focus is still mostly internal on this sort of internal wound and internal sort of collective shock and trauma. But I think the horror of October 7th is that Israelis feel like they're not protected. Israelis feel like they've become sitting ducks. And
mhm,
while Netanyahu and his extremist government were focused on trying to on their power grab and trying to reduce the power of the judiciary and trying to save Netanyahu himself from going to jail, as some of your viewers may know, he's on trial right now, if you can believe that,
mhm,
for corruption and could face possible jail time. This is the person who's leading Israel, both in peacetime before the war and also during war. And the incredible price tag of having this kind of leadership has now fully dawned, I think, on most Israelis, and the terrible price that has been paid for keeping his eye off the ball and the government's eye off the ball has been paid. With over 1,200 dead Israelis, and of course all of the thousands, tens of the
mhm.
10,000 plus Palestinian dead now. So and also sort of on a micro level, I mean, I'll just share with you a story that I found particularly
Yes, please.
disturbing, which is along the border of Gaza, there are these very high-tech fences and all of this sort of machinery, and there was always this sort of sense of like relying on digital information. But part of that information was taken by human beings. And who are these human beings? They're called lookouts or spotters, and
Mhm,
they're uniformly women are put in these positions because they have to have these long shifts of 9 hours where they have their own little patch of ground across the border to be looking at, and they know every little bit of it, every rock, every flower, every road. And they were warning for weeks and weeks that they saw Hamas on the border mobilizing, it looked like, for some kind of doing exercises for some kind of potential attack. And they were telling their officers and they were telling their higher ups. And what happened? They were told to basically shut up. They were told by higher ranking male officers, okay, that they had to stop bothering them with this information. And they were even threatened in one case to be court-martialed if they kept nattering on about this. And what happened on the morning of October 7th? They were slaughtered, those women, many of them, okay? 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old women were slaughtered. And also there were also, of course, the terrible stories of rapes, right? And then some of them were taken into Gaza. And so then this is a terrible story of both sexism and hubris. And so these stories are coming out and they're continuing to come out. And there is a lot of, on top of the grief and the agony, there's just a lot of internal rage as well about the incompetence that led to the moment of the morning of October 7th.
Dina, we're running long, but if I can ask two more questions, the last two questions, please. What are we outside observers missing?
The complexity, that there is, that on the one hand, there's a lot of these calls, for ceasefire. And I think but at the same time, what I'm seeing from, let's say, the ceasefire, but no call at the same time for releasing the hostages, there's this sense that I think a lot of Israelis feel with the protests around the world that Israel's very right to exist is being called into doubt. That Israelis are being called, colonizers, and are accused of sort of being seen as some sort of like, imperial, white people, and their pain doesn't matter as much, and their crimes are great and against the Palestinian people, and therefore they deserve this in some way. And I think people need to know that there's a lot, every time you come to this place, and I hope one day you will, I can show you around. It is not black and white. There are lots of shades of gray, and Israel deserves to have a country as much as anybody deserves to have a country. And there have been a lot of mistakes that Israel has made along the way. I think any Israeli will tell you that. But at the same time, and especially in regards of its treatment of the Palestinians, and a lot of things now are coming home to roost, right? But at the same time, Israel was attacked and Israel was assaulted. And Israel also has a right to self-defense. And what does that mean? And how does it defend itself? Is a very open question. And I feel like all of the answers are difficult ones. But I think this idea of just having a ceasefire, it just lets, as without any conditions, without sort of having a plan for perhaps international forces to come in, for diplomacy to work. I think a lot of Israelis understand that there needs to be finally a political solution, and there will never be fully a military solution to this. But how do you prepare the ground for a proper political solution? Hamas cannot be part of that political solution. So people are protesting out there in the world. I think people have to also understand that Hamas has also, committed war crimes, and Hamas has a genocidal agenda. And they don't hide it. And I think that's part of the gray that people have to understand. And how can Palestinians live in dignity and peace? How can Israelis live in dignity and peace? How can we finally get back to a solution? Two-state solution, one-state solution feels like even further away right now than it did in the past, but that's also something that people have spoken about over the years, some sort of binational rule. But I think everyone understands that this cannot go on. If there's any sort of like light in the crack of this horrible, dark moment, is that possibly now there can be a path forward to getting to a political solution, because there's so much suffering on both sides. And there's so much agony, and we can't wait for the next time for this to happen.
Dina, you co-authored this beautiful best-selling memoir, My Friend Anne Frank. I wonder, what would Anne Frank have thought about what's happening now?
Wow, I don't want to speak for Anne Frank, but I can talk about Hannah, her best friend, whose memoir I wrote, and she spoke always about that what is the sort of the lasting story of the Holocaust? It's a cautionary tale that hatred kills and dehumanization kills. And I think there's been a lot of dehumanization, both of Israelis of Palestinians and Palestinians of Israelis. So first of all, I think that's what Hannah would talk about, is a very terrible price of the dehumanization and hatred can lead to. Hannah happened to be a religious woman, and she always spoke about that all people are created in the image of God. And then we have to remember that. And I think that is exactly what was forgotten on October 7th, and exactly what's been forgotten throughout these many, many years of this conflict, that we are all people, and that most people want to get on and live their lives. And the question is, how can we do that with full equality and full dignity and full respect to both peoples, both Israelis and Palestinians? How can we finally get towards that day? And I think leading the path are a lot of really impressive activists inside Israel, and I think Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I think the fact that they are doing a lot of important work together right now. I'll give a shout out to an organization called Standing Together, for example, that's been doing a lot of outreach between Israeli and Palestinian citizens. And they've had huge gatherings in these last few weeks of people, and lots of people joining in their efforts. And I think that is a light forward for us, as more people sort of seeing each other as real full people. And I think hopefully can be a bridge towards something different.
Dina Kraft, opinion editor of Haaretz English, thank you very much. This has been an enlightening, even stirring conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for us tonight. As always, the next step for engaged citizens is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy and supporting other democracies and other democratic projects. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.